Welcome to Madlik. My name is Geoffrey Stern, and at Madlik we light a spark or shed some light on a Jewish text or tradition. Along with Rabbi Adam Mintz, we host Madlik Disruptive Torah on Clubhouse every Thursday and share it as the Madlik podcast on your favorite platform. This week's Torah portion is Titzaveh. We survey the prophetic and rabbinic reimagining of a temple culture without a temple. But we also continue our discussion from last week where we noted how Jewish Messianism includes an often violent break with accepted practice, intentionally breaking moral and rabbinic norms to hasten the end. We explore how after the Six-Day War, but specifically after the Oslo Accords, previous rabbinic guidance relating to the sanctity of the Temple Mount has been cast aside. So join us for Temple Politics. Well, welcome back. Another week in Madlik, and obviously, I think we've all been watching the news out of Israel, and two beautiful Jewish souls were killed in a terrorist attack. But afterwards, some of the video that we've all seen is as I wouldn't say as disturbing. Nothing can be as disturbing as the loss of life. But some seemingly ultra-Orthodox Jews lit some Palestinian homes on fire, and as the sun set, decided to daven Marav. And that juxtaposition of praying while people's homes burned was really disconcerting to say the least. So, as I said in the introduction, we're going to continue the conversation of what the temple means and what it meant after it was no longer with us. But we are going to fast forward into the present in terms of how the temple has been politicized in terms of the change in halacha, and what more better subject for Madlik than to review how halacha is changing in front of our very eyes. Rabbi Adam, how are you this week?
I'm really good. I mean, it's not California, but we're good here in New York, and I'm looking forward. This is a great conversation, and I'm looking forward to having it.
Fantastic. So in our Parsha, Exodus 28:2 says, make sacred vestments for your brother Aaron for dignity and adornment. Make bigdei kodesh, holy clothing, for Aaron, your brother, lichvod uletiferet, for kavod and adornment, beauty. And maybe you are not aware, because we've really not discussed this tradition in Judaism many times before, but there is a tradition that there are a certain set numbers of commandments, 613 commandments, and at a certain time Maimonides wrote a book called Sefer HaMitzvot, and this began a tradition of writing a book and counting the very different commandments. So the first thing that one does when one looks at a innocuous pasuk like this, a verse like this, that simply says, do something, one wants to see, did it rank to become one of those 613 commandments? And lo and behold, in Sefer HaMitzvot, the positive commandments, number 33, it says that he commanded the priests to wear special garments for glory and adornment so they can serve in the temple. And that is his saying, and make holy garments for your brother Aaron from glory and adoration. So he quotes our verse, and he says that this is an actual commandment. And he goes on to say, and it already appears in the Sifra, which is a midrashic commentary, that wearing these garments is a positive commandment. So we've been focused in the last week or two on building the tabernacle, the Mishkan, and now we're getting to the accessories, if you will. And from this verse, we learn that the clothing, wearing the clothing is an accessory. But Rabbi, the first thing that struck me was the pasuk says, make sacred, make v'asita bigdei kodesh, make them. And all of the commentaries universally say that the commandment is to wear the special garments. Are you struck by that as well?
Yeah, I mean, you should make them so they can wear them. The point is, if you make them and they sit in the closet, you haven't accomplished anything. Because, you see, there's a lot of ceremony in this. There's a lot of choreography in this. And the question is how it appears, how it looks. So it's not biasita, but it's that you should make them so they should wear them.
So I think that there's total logic to that, and we should know, and this is a wonderful opportunity to discuss different types of commandments. Obviously, the biggest distinction is between positive commandments and negative commandments. But then there are commandments, for instance, that are dependent on time, that maybe women aren't required to do. There are also commandments that need to be in the land of Israel, mitzvot hatluyot ba'aretz. And there's a subset of those commandments that you need a temple for. You know, the question is, can you go ahead and make these garments or wear the garments if you don't have the temple? We're going to get into that, but I thought I should mention it because we quoted from the book of mitzvot. It's fascinating that even though there are 613 mitzvot, Rabbi, and all of us would love to say, I've done every one of them, there are some of those mitzvot that are beyond our reach. You need the land of Israel. It's dependent on something.
Yeah, I mean, that for sure is right. And, the temple is fascinating because it doesn't apply anymore, because none of us have experienced it. So we're imagining, it's mostly in the imagination. You might have a book that has the picture of what the Kohen looked like, but basically it's in our imagination. And that's kind of fun to imagine it. Meaning, what I mean is like this. When the Torah tells you how to have a Seder, that's not in our imagination. In 6 weeks, we're going to have a Seder. We know what a Seder is like. And we know how our Seder is similar to and different from what the Torah describes. But we don't really know what V'asita Bigdei Kodesh Li'aharon Achicha L'Chavod U'Letifaret. We don't really know what that means, because we've never seen it before.
That's a fascinating point. I had not thought about that. But it also means that, and we have touched upon this subject before, that some commandments, even though they command you what to do, cannot be done, so they become a little bit symbolic. And I'll take some poetic license to translate what you were saying about imagining to taking symbolically or to trying to understand what lies behind that. What did it look like, or what did it mean, or what emotions did it trigger? I think we're saying the same thing in slightly different ways. So the Sefer HaChinuch is also a fascinating book. It was actually, I believe, a book written by a dad to his son, and he went from parsha to parsha, and in each parsha, he picked out the commandments in that parsha. So he writes about the commandment really about building the Mishkan. He says this commandment is practiced at the time that most of Israel is upon their land. Meaning to say, if most of Israel is not in the land of Israel, you do not have a positive commandment to build a temple. And this is from the commandments that are not impingent upon the individual, but rather upon all of the community. When the temple, so that's kind of interesting. I guess there are other commandments like Hakel, where you have to gather everybody together. It's probably a commandment for the king to do something. I've never really thought about a commandment that is incumbent upon the whole community as opposed to every Jew to participate in. It's kind of an interesting concept.
It's kind of a Talmudic distinction. Right?
And again, I don't know whether it's unique. I don't know whether it's unique or not.
I don't know if it is either, but it's kind of Talmudic. And what's the difference? I mean, everybody is obligated, or the community is obligated, which obligates everybody.
I think if you tie it to the first sentence, it becomes interesting. The commandment is practiced at the time when most of Israel is upon the land. So to use the language that I used before, it's talui al hatzibur in a sense. It is dependent on the whole of Israel to be in a particular situation. And then he finishes, when the temple is built speedily in our days, a positive commandment will be fulfilled. So it's very forward thinking. And as you can all imagine, all of the texts that we study, all of the rabbinic texts pretty much are after the destruction of the temple. The rise of rabbinic Judaism was mostly triggered by the destruction of the temple. The famous words of Yochanan ben Zakkai as he left the Jerusalem and the temple that were going to be destroyed, he says, Tein li Yavna v'chachameha. Give me the academy of the rabbis and its scholars. So we're going to look a little bit about some of the approaches, I think, to how the temple really is kept alive as either something, as you described before, Rabbi, something that you can imagine, or something that you can be inspired by, or simply study.
Right. I think that really is the question. And it's interesting that you went to the chinuch, because since the chinuch was written by a rabbi for his son, actually he says that the reason he wrote it for him is that Shabbat afternoon his son was going and playing in the park, and he thought he should be studying Torah. So he wrote something about all the laws in every parsha, something he could study with his son, which is kind of funny that in the 1300s they had the same issues that we have in the 21st in the 21st century. But but it's interesting because he always has that kind of what's the lesson in each of the commandments.
Yes. So here is the interesting thing. We talked about how will we imagine the temple. The first thing is, and this is kind of unique, when you said what you said, Rabbi, about since we don't have the big day kahuna, the clothing of the kohanim, we don't have the candelabra, we have to imagine what they were like. But Maimonides in Mishnah Torah says that the design structure built by King Solomon is described explicitly in the Book of Kings. So if we were to imagine Solomon's temple, we could look back in the Book of Kings. In contrast, the design of the Messianic temple, what is called the third temple, though mentioned in the Book of Ezekiel, is not explicit or explained. Eino mufurash umvoar. So that is kind of fascinating. It really does give you a sense of it's an open-ended imagination that we're talking about.
Yes, I think that's right. I mean, that's a great way to say it. It's an open-ended imagination. It's imagination, but at the same time, it's open-ended, but at the same time, the Torah gives you such detail. The entire parsha this week is the detail about what these clothing look like.
Yes. Yes, and we will go into some of the things that we say every morning to discuss how often we actually think about the way things looked and the way things were in those days. So let's go on a little bit further in the Sefer HaChinuch. He talks about, and this is one of the things that I saw over and over again in many of the commentaries, the commandment of building the choice house, build the house for the sake of God, and he goes back to let them make me a sanctuary. We certainly dwelt on that a lot. And he says the commandment includes everything, all the accessories inside of it, the menorah, the table, and he says the roots of the commandment, he really brings back to Sinai, and he says, I'm afraid of drawing close to the dwelling of God, as I know that anyone who comes close that has not sufficiently sanctified himself will not see the house alive. Remember, before the Torah was given, they had to purify themselves for 3 days, but then they have to step back from the temple. There is this sense about standing away from the temple that is part and parcel of the temple itself. He goes on to say, make a holy of holies, and in front of the holies is another place called a chamber, and then they call that the sanctuary, and we make a partition around the sanctuary distant from it, like the curtains of the courtyard, and then there's the courtyard, and then the tent of meeting, and the whole thing is called the temple. It's almost an enigma inside of an enigma. The the temple itself is something that you have to step back from because of its holiness. And then he goes to great lengths to show even the design of the temple itself has the Holy of Holies in the middle. Then it has another section. It has this word mechitza, a divider, a partition, and you step back and you step back. I was kind of struck by that.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of having different sections, different levels of holiness is a very interesting thing, because different people were allowed to enter the different sections of holiness. The Holy of Holies, only the high priest was allowed to enter. The holy, any priest could enter. And around the tabernacle or the temple in Jerusalem, everybody was allowed to congregate. So you have a very interesting thing where the holiness is reflected in terms of access. Where else do you have such a thing? By the way, our synagogues are not built that way. There's equal access to everybody. Now, in an Orthodox synagogue, there is a separation between men and women, but that has nothing to do with access of holiness. That's just so the men will keep their eyes on the sitter. So that's a whole different kind of consideration. But isn't that interesting that holiness is reflected in access?
It is, and what it triggered in me is, you've seen these pictures of time immemorial, Jews coming and playing at the kotel. And what are they doing when you pray at the kotel? You're praying on the outside, looking in. You're outside of that mechitza. And I always thought that was a very unnatural thing to do. But in a sense, if you think of the Kodesh Kodashim that was only entered one time a year, its purpose was you were to be outside of it. And so that kind of resonated with me, that I wouldn't say that it was normalizing the situation of the day, which is that we no longer had access to the temple. But it's certainly, between comparing it to Mount Sinai and then talking about the structure as these growing circles of access, gave something unique about the Jewish post-temple experience, which is we worshipped our holy place from the outside. That was my takeaway.
Good. I like that takeaway. I think that's good. Okay. So what's the next step? Where do we go from here?
So the next step is I went to the siddur. Where else would a Jew go but to the prayer book that we use every single day? And in the prayer book, we read certain biblical portions every morning. Partially because we make a blessing every morning to learn Torah, and like any other blessing, you have to make a blessing on doing the act. So you have to learn it. But in our Siddur, it has a whole section on korbanot, on sacrifices. And it introduces it by saying, the Talmud in Masechta Menachos states, Rabbi Isaac said, why does it say in Leviticus, this is the law of the sin offering, this is the law of the guilt offering? To teach us that when one studies the law of the sin offering, it is considered as though he had actually brought it on the altar. And one studies the law of the guilt offering, it is as if he had actually brought it on the altar. Rather than merely recite the following portions, study them and attempt to learn about the laws and significance of the various sacrifices. So in a sense, getting back to the Sefer HaMitzvot, the 613 commandments, the Jewish tradition, the rabbis are desperately trying to take back, to maintain access to these commandments. And in typical rabbinic fashion, they said, study it. And studying it will be considered as good as doing it. I thought that was a fascinating reflex.
It's absolutely fascinating. Study it or pray for it. It's more than just study it. It's pray for its restoration. Always this idea of looking forward till we want it to come back. Now, that in itself is an interesting question. Do we actually want the sacrifices to come back? Will there be sacrifices the way that there were sacrifices? The idea of sacrificing animals, that's a big dispute, whether there will be sacrifices. But in the big picture, we want to have a temple.
Absolutely. And that's why if you continue with the Siddur, you have a Yehi Ratzon, may it be your will, to compassion on us, to forgive us of all of our sins, to atone, and to speedily build the Holy Temple in our days. So it's both this study, but as you say, there's clearly a request that the words that we say, and now I'm going to quote, therefore, may it be thy will, our God and Lord of our forefathers, that the speech of our lips will be valued and accepted and welcome before you as though we have sacrificed the Tamid's sacrifice. So there's this combination of studying it, but also making it real. Now, maybe there are some of you who come a little late to synagogue and aren't right there for the Kabbanot at the beginning. But those of you who are there for Musaf know that we have a major part of the Musaf services where we ask God to reinstate these sacrifices and bring back the temple. And this is an area where reform probably just takes it out. My conservative Siddur actually just offers an alternative that doesn't talk about bringing back the temple, but bringing back the joy of being in the land, so forth and so on. But clearly, for any traditional Jew, and I would argue for any Jew who reads the classic Siddur, you do have to ask the question that you raised a second ago, Rabbi, is how do I say these words if I'm ambivalent at most and really cynical about the idea of, to put it into my words, we need a third temple like a Lachen cup. We need it like a hole in the head. But how do you read these words? Why don't you talk to us personally, Rabbi? What is your feeling about not only the third temple, but are you convinced that there are going to be sacrifices at that temple? What do you think when you read these words?
So, number one, I'm not convinced they're going to be sacrifices. I think that's something that's very much up in the air. When you think about Judaism, when there was a temple, the center of Judaism was the temple. Now, forget about sacrifices for a minute. 3 times a year, on the 3 holidays of Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot, the Jews, it was the male Jews, but that's just because it was the ancient world. It was the Jews traveled to Jerusalem to congregate in the temple. Josephus writes that at the beginning of the 1st century CE, there were 1 million people who came to the temple. That number is probably too big because probably there aren't 1 million people who could fit there. But leave that aside for a minute. That's a detail. 1 million people came. So the temple was really a gathering place for people. And everything was done at the temple. The sacrifices were done at the temple. The prayers were done at the temple. And the celebration of the Seder was done in houses around the temple. So while the conservative movement accepts the fact that that was once true, it just doesn't pray for its restoration in the future. The Reform movement doesn't like the whole idea of temple. But the truth of the matter is that temple is very important to everybody. As a central location, it's very important to everybody. We know that because for all of us, shul is a central location. Now, some people go to shul more often. Some people go to shul less often. That's a detail. The point is that shul is a central place. On Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, the place you go is to your shul. And everybody likes their shul. They don't go to another shul on Yom Kippur. They go to their shul. So the idea that the synagogue, like the temple, is a meeting place is still very important for us.
So I totally agree. I do want to focus on not so much temple meeting place, but temple sacrifices. And I want to take it back to the prophetic tradition. If you look at Isaiah 1:11 through 17, and I'm not sure is this something that we say on the high holidays? I mean, it's a pretty powerful statement. Isaiah says, "What need have I of all your sacrifices, says the Lord. Lama li ro zivchechem." And he goes on to say, "I'm sated with burnt offerings and rams, suets and fatlets, bloods and bulls. I have no delight in lambs and he-goats. Who asked that of you?" He says, "They fill me with loathing. They are become a burden to me. I cannot endure them. And when you lift up your hands, I will turn my eyes away. Though you pray at length, I will not listen." And of course, here's the punchline. "Your hands are stained with crime. Wash yourselves clean. Put your evil doings away from my sight. Cease to do evil. Learn to do good. Devote yourself to justice. Aid the wronged. Uphold the right of the orphan. Defend the cause of the widow." My God, it sounds like a lefty reform rabbi. What's going on here?
Crazy. Well, first of all, let me just identify it. That is the Haftorah for the Shabbos before Tisha B'Av. That's a Tisha B'Av message. It's not a high holiday message. It's a Tisha B'Av message. That's the reason the temple was destroyed, because the sacrifices weren't meaningful, because they were mistreating the poor people, because they weren't treating one another properly. So who cared about the sacrifices? So that it is definitely part of the liturgy. It's one of the most striking pieces of the liturgy of the whole year, and it is the Haftorah for the Shabbos before Tisha B'Av. Actually, that Shabbat is called after the Haftorah. It's called Shabbat Chazon, because the first word in the Haftorah is the word Chazon.
Amazing. To have it before Tisha B'Av, that just blows me away. Somebody's saying something to us.
Yeah, they sure are.
So Hosea 6:6 is something you can actually put on a bumper sticker. "For I desire goodness, not sacrifice, obedience to God rather than burnt offerings." Wow. So there is definitely a tradition. And of course, you have to put it into context. Not so much saying I don't want the sacrifice, but if I have to choose between you guys being moral and ethical and taking care of the stranger and the widow and your sacrifices, I don't want them. But certainly there is this sense of we've done that, we've been there. It didn't impact the way you live. In Devarim Rabbah, the Midrash, it says, "To do what is right and just is more desired by the Lord than sacrifice." In Proverbs, he says, "Scripture does not say as much as sacrifice, but more than sacrifice." Whereas sacrifices could only function inside the temple, to do what is right and just is mandated inside and outside of the temple. And he goes on. So anyone who tells you that this ambivalence about a temple is a Western assimilationist, humanistic, reform, Goyish idea, just go look at our source sheet and come back to me in the morning.
Okay, that's a great verse that you chose. And again, it's a very striking verse.
So now what I would like to do is to get into the present time. You know, there are many times that we look at the development of halakha, or we look at the slippery slope of the reform or conservative movement, where they made a minor change. Mendelssohn, who's considered to be the founder of the reform movement, what did he change? He gave the sermons in German, not in Yiddish. You pointed that out a few weeks ago. And the rabbi said, watch this slippery slope. First thing you're doing is changing the language in the synagogue. Next time you'll be driving to the synagogue and from the synagogue to the country club. It's just a slippery slope. Well, today we're going to look at a different slippery slope. The 2,000 years of Jewish tradition have been that we stay afar from the temple. Even Rav Kook, who made a yeshiva called Teret Kohanim. It was started even before him. The goal of that yeshiva was to do exactly what we described in the morning prayers, which is to study the laws of the sacrifices. Early rabbis, some of them, and of course this was a hypothetical conversation till after the Six-Day War. Comes the Six-Day War, and all of a sudden we have a dilemma. We now have access to the Temple Mount. We have access again to the Western Wall. And we all know the famous story of Moshe Dayan seeing them about to raise a Israeli flag over the Dome of the Rock, and he told them to take it down. And he looked for the Waqf, and he says, "You guys stay in charge." He was clearly a secular Jew. But the rabbis on June 8th, Israel Radio issued the warning, and it says, "Do not enter the site." At the first council of the Chief Rabbinate, Chief Rabbi Nissim and Untamam, the Sephardic and Ashkenazi chief rabbis, continued to argue that Jews must not be permitted to enter. Those signs that you and I, Rabbi, saw the first time we came close to the Temple Mount that said, almost as though it was a minefield, the warning signs to be placed at the entrance were placed there by Yitzchak Abu Hasera, Rabbi of Ramla. So that is what you would expect to find, that we would continue our tradition of keeping far afield from this sacred space. I should say the halachic reasons are that because we do not have the red heifer, we cannot purify ourselves. We are all impure, and we cannot stand on that holy spot.
I mean, that is the traditional Orthodox explanation. That's why there are many Orthodox who will not go up on the Temple Mount. You see, the Temple Mount now is complicated because the Temple Mount is political. But if you knock out the Temple Mount, right, and Ben Gvir went up on the Temple Mount and it was very political. But if you knock out the politics, there's a religious discussion. Again, holiness is reflected in access. Do we have the right to go up on the Temple Mount? Or are we getting too close to the Holy of Holies where we don't have access? So that's a very interesting question. And that's why there are all those signs that are up there warning people about going up to the Temple Mount.
But, and we don't have much time left, but now we see on a regular basis Jews going up, Jews questioning the status quo of not being allowed to worship there. And in the source sheet, you will see I quote extensively by an Israeli academic named Moti Inbari. And what his theory is, and I'm convinced by it, is that between the Six-Day War and the Oslo Accords, things stayed pretty static. But what happened after the Oslo Accords, when there was language that the Temple Basin would be shared space, that they had a fear that the Temple Mount will be lost and transferred to Arab control, legitimizing far-reaching changes. And as a result, there was a monumental meeting of the Yesha Council. And all of a sudden, they decided that not only are you permitted to go there, but rabbis should help their congregants, their followers, to go to the Temple Mount. And all of a sudden, you have the creation of organizations like the Temple Institute. I have a little piece in there with Rabbi Riskin and the brother of Meir Kahana trying on, or being measured, I should say, for the Big Day Kahuna, the holy garments of the Kohanim that we started with. And there seems to be, I kind of read between the lines, Rabbi, I think they tried to hedge their bets and said, these aren't actual Big Day Kahuna. I think there might have been a sense that maybe we're not supposed to make them, or I couldn't find a prohibition against it, but they're taking the measurements to be ready. Am I reading too much into it, or was there a little bit of controversy associated with that?
I think there was a little controversy there. I think you're reading exactly what was there.
So, and I think I love Rabbi Riskin, and when I read about it, I thought it was just beautiful, fun. Many times we look at these things and we give the benefit of the doubt, and we are nostalgic, and we see the joy on the face. But I think that ultimately, what we are seeing in Israel today, when we're talking about increasing the settlements, part of that is so that there are Jews in all of the land of Israel, which is the trigger that we saw. And part of it is also the Temple Mount issue, where all of a sudden in our lifetimes, we have seen this step-by-step watering down of the halacha, but not done by Reform Jews, but done by religious Jews in order to meet their political ends. And I just think it's a fascinating exercise. And I would also argue, because they do quote Dichter, who was the head of the intelligence service, where they have intercepted multiple attempts to blow up the Temple Mount. And there is no question that if we manage the relationship on the Temple Mount in a wrong fashion, we could be talking about a seismic event. And I think that is not something that is beyond the understanding of these players. And as I said last week, for you and me, a seismic event that could create a war and bloodshed is something that would keep us away. For other people, it's an invitation to the party. And I am concerned about that, and that's why I raise it today.
I would agree with you 100%. Thank you, Geoffrey, for an amazing topic. We wish everybody Shabbat Shalom and Happy Purim. And we look forward to seeing you next week. Be well, everybody.
Be well, Shabbat Shalom. Don't drink too much, but don't drink too little, Rabbi. And we'll see you all next week. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.